There's so much that we can talk about with .NET 10 and related things like C# 14. So I'm going to try and focus on a few of the highlights that are personal highlights for me. So let's start with the language, actually, C# 14.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Modern.NET Show, the premier .NET podcast focusing entirely on the knowledge, tools, and frameworks that all .NET developers should have in their toolbox. I'm your host, Jamie Taylor, bringing you conversations with the brightest minds in the .NET ecosystem. Today, we're joined by Mark J. Price to talk about some of our favorite things in .NET 10 and his new 4-part book series on quite literally everything .NET. Mark is one of the most prolific authors in the .NET space at the moment, and his new book series is shaping up to be a fantastic resource.
One of the things that I've always appreciated with Microsoft and their culture is that they have a very strong requirement that things are as backwards compatible as possible.
Along the way, we talked about the recent changes to the STS, or Standard Term Support Lifecycle, for .NET, bringing more support for the odd-numbered versions of .NET and giving companies more time to migrate from one version to the next. We also covered a very important point when it comes to either STS or LTS towards the end of the episode. Essentially, keep your runtimes up to date, folks. This episode marks the 5th appearance of Mark on the show. Mark has been a wonderful collaborator over the years, and long may that continue. We joke about the fact that Mark deserves an award for being the guest with the most appearances, but maybe he does deserve an award, unless someone out there is willing to beat his record, of course. Before we jump in, a quick reminder. If the Modern.NET Show has become part of your learning journey, then please consider supporting us through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Every contribution helps us to continue bringing you these in-depth conversations with industry experts. You'll find all the links in the show notes. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and we'll dive into the core of modern.NET. Mark, it's been too long since we last chatted, and welcome back to the show. This is your 5th appearance on the show. You definitely deserve some kind of award for this.
Yes, I'm looking forward to having a pint or a coffee or a Subway sandwich or something with you at some point.
We will have to make that happen for sure. So, would you mind, Mark, just sort of giving the folks who are listening a bit of a brief introduction, just in case they haven't heard the other 4 episodes you've been on?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me back on, Jamie. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. My name is Mark Price. I've been developing with Microsoft Technologies since Visual Basic back in 1993 when I graduated from university, Bristol University, go Bristol. I worked for Microsoft Training and Certification Group from 2001 to 2003. So I was working on the teams that were writing the first training courses about Microsoft.NET and worked with the teams who were writing the exams for the certifications around .NET as well. I've spent most of my career in education, teaching developers on Microsoft.NET since it was around in 2001. In particular, for the past 10 years, I've been an author for Pact. And my best-selling C# and .NET book has just had its 10th edition. At the time of recording, it was published 2 days ago because we're still actually in the middle of .NET Conf. We're on day 3, I think, now, or it will be starting later. So .NET 10 has officially been released, general availability, a couple of days ago, and my book has been published. But that's not the only book that I'm releasing for .NET 10. I've actually been working on a 4-book series, all on .NET 10. The first book covers the core language and runtime fundamentals with C# 14, so that's the one that's just been published. The second book walks through real-world web development using mature technologies like ASP.NET Core MVC and Web API using controllers, as well as looking at third-party things that build on top of that, like Umbraco, CMS. The third book focuses on modern apps and services, so technologies like .NET MAUI and Blazor, as well as ASP.NET Core Minimal API for building web services, and GraphQL and gRPC. And then the fourth book gives developers a practical tooling and workflow skills that you need for modern .NET. So covering technologies like Git, doing documentation, covering a lot of the slightly more theoretical academic topics like patterns and practices and principles that you should follow. So that fourth book is a bit more for people who definitely want to have a professional career. So students should benefit a lot from that and help with interviews and getting that job. And so taken together, they form a complete path from the absolute basics to real production work. So that's a bit about me and a bit about the 4 books that I'm in the middle of publishing. But hopefully, by the time that someone is actually listening to this podcast, all 4 books should have been published and will be available to order, and you can start enjoying them straight away.
Prolific. That's the word I'll use. Prolific. A heck of an undertaking to write effectively a 4-book series on everything you need to know.
Yeah, I am feeling absolutely exhausted at the moment, just getting that first book out and going through the kind of final edits of the other books. Luckily, I think I got the order of the books to be published right, in the sense that for the first book that covers the language, C# and the libraries, .NET 10 core libraries, Microsoft is actually really good at providing previews all through this past year, from February until the release candidates in September and October. Microsoft is very public, very transparent, and the new C# features and the core .NET features do tend to become available through those previews. So I am able to write the code, add and expand the topics on that first book, while still having a very high quality book that can publish on the day that .NET comes out. Whereas what I've discovered is that supporting technologies like, say, Aspire, or a lot of the AI technologies and tools within the code editor or your IDE, like Visual Studio 2026, those kind of supporting technologies often have last-minute changes or announcements on the actual day of .NET 10's release. And so that's been quite useful in that I've still got another month or two to finalize the chapters which are on those new technologies. Like, for example, Aspire 13, which I think most people were expecting, including myself, to be Aspire 10. And it's been quite interesting to see everyone kind of say, why are we skipping over Aspire 10 and 11 and 12 and going to 13? And from what I can tell, it's related to the fact that Aspire is now really a polyglot solution to local development. So previously in Aspire 8 and Aspire 9, they were tied to .NET 8 and .NET 9 because they were 100% a .NET local development solution. Whereas Aspire 13 is designed to be, first of all, drop the .NET branding. So it's just Aspire rather than .NET Aspire now. And the version number really forces a break with the link to .NET. So it is not part of .NET 10. It is not only limited to .NET 10 anymore. It now has full support for JavaScript and Python development as well. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into Python and JavaScript in my books. I'm still going to focus on using Aspire for .NET, which in fact apparently is internally what they now describe it, if they're trying to emphasize that it's the bits which are really focused on .NET, Aspire for .NET, rather than .NET Aspire. But anyway, apparently that was the main reason. And also, why 13? It's a prime number, and we all love prime numbers, don't we?
Yep. I remember the conversation that happened at .NET Conf. So the conversation happened 2 days ago, but for the folks listening, it happened months ago. It went a little bit like this. We need to break from .NET 10, so we can't call it Aspire 10. We can't call it Aspire 11 because we don't want people to think that it's related to Windows 11. We don't want to use 12 because 13 is right there, and 13 is a prime number, so let's go with 13.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Very. I can just imagine the conversation that the Aspire team were having over the last few months, and it's so typically developer-y type conversation and final decision. But I support it. I like Aspire 13. I think it's going to be lucky for all of us.
Absolutely. And it kind of fits with their, how do I put it? Obviously, they are a very professional team, but they're a little tongue-in-cheek in some of their things that they say and do when it's not .NET Conf, when it's like For folks listening, if you haven't checked it out, they have their own YouTube channel and they do a thing called Aspire Fridays, where they try to aspirify. Sorry, that took me a whole bunch of times to get, but aspirify, i.e. take something and put Aspire behind it, underneath it to support it. They take an open source project and try to build it with Aspire. Most of the things that they've done have only taken a handful of hours to do, and they do it live, right? You can see them in Visual Studio Code or in Visual Studio working on these things, and then they release a pull request and just say, you don't have to merge it, but here's all of the work required to put Aspire behind this thing. And they're not all .NET projects, which is amazing.
Amazing is absolutely the word. And seeing it all done live, those Aspirify sessions and the ASP.NET Core stand-ups, those are, is it monthly? I'm pretty sure they're very frequent anyway. I love how transparent the Microsoft teams are these days.
Absolutely. And there was something, I want to bring it up just to show a bit of silliness, but maybe it'll happen. I have no visibility of this. But during the keynote at .NET Conf, they handed over to Maddie, who is the PM for the Aspire team. And she said, I know this is .NET Conf. This isn't Aspire Conf. That may happen or may not. Watch this space. So maybe there'll be a separate conference just for Aspire. Who knows, right? Who knows what the future holds?
Yes. Hopefully it happened in December. A Christmas present for us all.
Oh, Wouldn't that be lovely? Yeah, all of the new different technologies that .NET either supports or is built with, they're all absolute. Obviously, not a lot of people are talking about .NET MAUI at the moment, but things like, it was only a few days ago, Avalonia UI announced that they have worked with Microsoft to bring .NET MAUI to the Linux desktop, which was something that, I don't know, I don't think it was on the roadmap, was what I'll say. I have no visibility of that team, and I'm not internal to Microsoft, but knowing that, because it's a community project, right? All of the .NET stuff, all right, yes, Microsoft takes the ownership of it, but it's all open source.
Yes.
So you can just go ahead and create a pull request.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of us .NET developers have been around for a while and have maybe had some slight disappointments over the years with things like Silverlight being abandoned and so on. Were maybe a little skeptical when the official .NET MAUI team was saying, Linux support, it's not something we're going to do. We're hoping the community will step up to that challenge. And I think a lot of us were thinking, well, that probably means it's never going to happen. So, where the joint partnerships with Avalonia and also the platform, I think they've done some work with the .NET MAUI team as well. So, the community actually is stepping up, because it does seem as if .NET MAUI is important enough to a lot of organizations that it's worth supporting. And long may that continue.
Absolutely. And just to sort of caveat the thing about the Linux on the desktop support, just real quick, for those who don't know, with Windows and Mac OS, you have one desktop system. You have the desktop, right? You may install a separate shell in Windows and get a slightly different start menu, but it's still Explorer. It's still the desktop, right? Because Linux isn't an operating system, it's the kernel. The distributions built upon Linux, they're all opinionated, and there's a million different ways to draw a window on screen. And so I can imagine, if it was me doing it, I wouldn't be able to support a billion different operating system configurations. So I fully appreciate why the decision was made to perhaps not have Linux on the desktop on the roadmap, right? Because that requires a whole team of people just to work on that. And I mean, is there really a demand for Linux on the desktop apps with .NET MAUI? I don't know. Maybe there is.
One of the decisions that I had to make about the third edition of my apps and services book, which covers .NET MAUI and Blazor and those kind of GUI type platforms, was whether I wanted to try and cover alternate third parties like Avalonia. And so what I have decided, I'm still working on the chapters as we're recording, but should be published by the time that you get to listen to this podcast. But what I decided to do is to have a chapter about .NET MAUI specifically on mobile development, because that's really its strength. It's great at building cross-platform, target both Android and iOS, and it does that job really well. Although it can support desktop on Windows and Mac Catalyst, it's not the best. It's going to look a little bit ugly. And so what I then decided to do is, and what's new in the third edition, is I've got a brand new chapter on Avalonia for building desktop applications, because then it actually looks much better. It can target Windows and Mac and Linux, and you can tell what kind of applications you could build because JetBrains Rider is cross-platform, and that's been built on Avalonia. So you can build absolutely professional enterprise-level applications for the desktop, truly cross-platform, including Linux, using technologies like Avalonia that then runs on top of .NET. And so that new chapter, I'm going to be interesting to see how readers react to that as a choice of, well, here's my recommendation if you want to do a desktop app, rather than trying to force .NET MAUI to do the desktop apps. And then the third kind of chapter on GUI is Blazor, to cover things like Blazor WebAssembly. So those are the three kind of app chapters in that new third edition. So I was actually really pleased to see that Avalonia is now working with the .NET MAUI team to help them target desktop on Linux. So maybe in the fourth edition, in a year or two, when I update that, maybe that will be stable enough and high enough quality that I'll rewrite that chapter. But we'll see. I'd love to hear from your listeners as well as my readers what they think about Avalonia.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like I'd like to point out, just to the listener, that obviously what Mark is saying is right. Like .NET MAUI, its primary focus is mobile app development. And so if you build an app with .NET MAUI and you want to run it on Windows, it will look like a mobile app, right? And it will feel like a mobile app because that's the primary target. You can do it, but do you really want to? I don't know. That's up to you and your business and your aims and your goals for your app. Whereas Avalonia, my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected either by you, Mark, or by someone yelling at me in the comments, is that Avalonia is an extension upon the work that WPF put in place, and then making that cross-platform and making that cross-paradigm. And so they're both coming from slightly different directions, right?
Yes.
With .NET MAUI having the Xamarin background and it being focused primarily on how do we run .NET on Android and iOS and make it look all nice and lovely for Android and iOS users. And then Avalonia having this pedigree of WPF, which was based on how do we build desktop applications that look like desktop applications that allow people to do desktop-y things. Because the paradigms are different, you're going to have slightly different expectations of how those UIs work. It comes down to everything, right? It's like pick the right tool in the toolbox for the job you're trying to do, which is why we have all these wonderful options. Avalonia, Project Uno, .NET MAUI, even Godot. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but if you want to use that, you totally can too, right? That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about some of the things that are happening with .NET, but I'm just wondering, there's lots of things happening with .NET 10. And by the time that folks will have listened to this, hopefully they'll have started the process of maybe migrating things over to .NET 10. A couple of gotchas that I know of, but I was wondering, are there any like standout features that make you go, oh my goodness, I don't know how we did .NET development before this thing happened?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that we can talk about with .NET 10 and related things like C# 14. So I'm going to try and focus on a few of the highlights that are personal highlights for me. So let's start with the language, actually, C# 14. As the number suggests, it's pretty mature now. Most of the low-hanging fruit for language features have now already been added, but there are always refinements that can be made. So my personal favorite for the language is extension members, in particular the new extension keyword that allows you to create a block, an extension block within a class or other type in order to define new members. And now not just methods, but also properties and constructors and other types of member. And that is fantastic. It's been something that the team has been debating internally how to implement literally for probably 15 years. So extension methods were first introduced with C# 3, back in, 2005, 2006, something like that. So 20 years ago. And it's taken this long to really come up with the best solution, the best compromise really, on how to enable other types of extension member. Particularly properties is probably the one that most people are most interested in. And so by introducing this new extension keyword and extension blocks, that then provides a place where you can specify, well, what do I want to extend? And so when you use the extension keyword, you can then specify, right, I want to extend the string type or the int type, or IEnumerable would be a very common one to want to extend. And then within that block, you can then define your properties and methods and other members. That's really great. We've been waiting for it for such a long time. They tried to make sure, well, they have made sure that it is backwards compatible. One of the things that I've always appreciated with Microsoft and their culture is that they have a very strong requirement that things are as backwards compatible as possible. So if you like and you prefer to use the traditional way of creating an extension method just by using the this keyword on a static method of a static class, you can continue to do that. All your existing code will continue to work. This new extension syntax literally just adds on to that. It's an alternative that does a lot more. So I think new developers who are learning it for the first time will probably just use the extension block syntax for all of their extension members. Traditionalists and myself, it'll probably take me a while to keep remembering that there is a newer way of doing this. But it's fantastic that the old way still works. So extension members, I'd say, is my favorite. But there are some small improvements in the language as well. One that sometimes confuses people is the new null conditional assignment. And so this is the ? dot type syntax. Now, we've had that exact characters, the combination of a question mark and a dot, a null check on the right-hand side of an assignment. That's been there for a few years now. And so that allows you to say, well, I've got this object. This object might be null, but it also has this property. So if it's null, if the whole object is null, I don't want to throw a null reference exception just because I'm trying to access one of its members, like reading a property. And so if I do object name ? Dot and then the property name, it will either successfully read the property if the object is not null, and if it's null, just return null. So at least you're not throwing an exception. So that's worked for a while, but you can now use that same ? Dot on the left-hand side of the assignment. Previously, you wouldn't be able to do that. So now what it's really doing is simplifying having to do a null check before you assign something to a property. So traditionally, you'd have to say, if my object is not null, then go to the object and set its property to something. Now you can just say object ? Dot property name equals, and then that entire statement, if the object that you're trying to assign to is null, it just won't do anything. So it won't throw an exception. Now, they could have implemented that null conditional assignment years ago when they did the right-hand side one, but they chose not to because they felt that it required too much knowledge about what was actually going to happen. Now they feel that C# developers are smart enough, I guess, to be able to choose to use it if they wish to, and save a couple of lines of code and not having to do an explicit null check, knowing that no assignment will happen if the object is null. So that's a tiny little one, but it could really improve your code in a lot of ways, as long as you're sure that you understand what it's actually doing or not doing. Just to go back to extension members, one of the things that I think could be a danger with that, as with all improvements to languages where there are now more ways of doing things, there's more flexibility in a language, that can also introduce dangers, because we can now extend our types with new properties and new methods and new other things, that could lead to the temptation of, when you're initially designing a class or a new type, you might say, well, do I need these properties? Should it have these methods? And it could be tempting to say, well, it doesn't matter if I'm missing a few, I can always just extend it later. And so this new feature, as great as it is, for anyone learning the language, I think the teachers need to really stress the importance of discipline and really thinking and planning your types rather than just relying on this ability to extend it later. But we'll see. We'll see. It's nice to always have these new features anyway.
Today's episode of the Modern.NET Show is brought to you by RJJ Software, strategic technology consulting for ambitious SMEs. You know me as the host of this podcast, but here's what you might not know. I'm also a Microsoft MVP who's helped businesses from Formula One teams to funded startups to transform technology from a cost center to a competitive advantage. At RJJ Software, we specialize in 3 things that matter to growing businesses. AI that actually delivers return on investment, not hype, just practical implementations that pay for themselves. Developer experience optimization. We've helped teams to achieve 99% faster deployments and 3x productivity gains. And strategic technology decisions, from architecture reviews to fractional CTO services. The difference? We don't just advise. We ensure successful implementation through knowledge transfer to your team. If you're an SME leader wondering why your technology investments aren't delivering, or if you're facing critical decisions about AI, modernization, or team productivity, let's talk. Visit rjj-software.co.uk/podcast to book a strategic consultation. Now let's get back to today's episode.
So for the language, I'd say those are some of the more important ones. Then moving on to, say, the .NET SDK. So with the SDK, we've had over the last couple of years improvements like being able to use top-level programs where you don't need to define an explicit program class with a main entry point method anymore. We can just type in a couple of lines, or even just literally one console.write line in a program.cs file, and all of the boilerplate code gets created for you. But you still need to have, or needed to have, a project file. This XML syntax where you define what target framework you want, whether you're generating a class library or an executable, controlling things like nullability options and so on. So you've always, up to this point, had to have a project file as well as at least one C# class file. And now one of the really nice things about the SDK in .NET 10 is that we now have this thing that Microsoft calls file-based apps, or as Maddie has finally learned to say, file-based apps, because there should be a hyphen between file and based, because it's an adjective that applies to the noun. But yeah, file-based apps. So what does that mean? That means you don't have to have a project anymore. And in fact, the new name for the traditional way of doing it is project-based apps. So file-based apps, you only have to have a C# file. With project-based apps, that's your traditional, where you've got a couple of C# file, or as many C# files as you like, plus a project file, a CS proj file extension. So file-based apps. The benefit that gives you is that it's much simpler. You can literally just create a single file, and it doesn't even have to be called program.cs. You could call it helloworld.cs. In that file, you could just have one statement, console.write line, for example, and you can now run that at the command line by using the .NET command line interface, the .NET CLI. And so the full command would be .NET, D-O-T-N-E-T, .NET, run, and then the file name, helloworld.cs. But the run is actually optional, so you can even cut that out. So just .NET and then the name of the file, and it will compile and run that file. Now, interestingly, that also then makes Aspire much easier to work with as well, because now you could create an Aspire orchestration project without having a project. It could just literally be a single CS file. And that then also fits in with this idea that Aspire 13 and later are polyglot, because you could have a Python backend, a Node.js front end, Node.js backend as well, perhaps, but no .NET on the backend at all, except for a single CS file, which is purely being used to orchestrate all of the other components of your application. So you literally are using Aspire and just a single C# file in order to then orchestrate a Python and JavaScript and all this other wonderful stuff. No project file required. And it'll be interesting to see how well that gets adopted. Longer term, the Aspire team has said that they would like to support Aspire with other languages, so that even that one kind of scripting or orchestration file in the future could be written in Python or JavaScript. For now, it still has to be C#, but combining Aspire 13 with this new file-based apps is a really cool way of the entire .NET team and all these features working together to improve developer productivity, particularly for local development. So I've been talking for quite a while now. Um,
No, well, I asked you what your favorite things were, and you told me what your favorite things were. That's fine.
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the file based application stuff. So .NET Hello.cs, that's the game changer, right? So I have related to the podcast. Actually, I have a whole bunch of JavaScript scripts that I will run. I'll just do node space the JavaScript file to perform those actions, right? Which is great. It works. It's fantastic. I'd rather do it with C Sharp, but I can't.
Mm.
Now that .NET 10 is out, I can rewrite those scripts in C Sharp and have an almost, it's not quite, but almost a REPL-like experience by just saying, hey, .NET, go run this application for me, run the script for me, right? The majority of for the folks who are listening, the majority of the things I do is related to like stripping out certain words and cleaning up transcripts and stuff, right? There are certain keywords that no transcript bot will do properly. And so I have a script that just goes load the full transcript and do a find and replace for these particular words, which was way easier to do in JavaScript because I could just do node space file. Now I can rewrite it in .NET and it won't run any faster. Maybe it will run faster, but I will be more productive because I can rewrite it in .NET and I will be able to, if I want to, I can then test it because I'll then know, I could throw an XUnit test at it or something. But, I would have to spin up a whole thing with the JavaScript ecosystem with like Jasmine or Jest or something to be able to test it. And I don't necessarily need to do that now.
Yeah. I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for us now.
And not just that, but like being able to teach too. So, back when I was at university, people of a certain vintage, the name Rob Miles, he's a legend. He was literally the lecturer that I had for Computer Science 101, which was taught using C Sharp. He didn't touch Visual Studio. His entire lectures, he'd plug a laptop into an overhead projector, which this is 2002, so that was a feat in itself. And then he'd fire up Notepad and just write code, and then bring up the terminal, do CSC, which if you're on Windows, it still exists. It is the .NET Framework C# compiler. CSC, the path to the file he'd just written, which would then spit out an exe, an executable file, and then he'd run that executable file from within the terminal. That whole thing now becomes one step. Not the whole thing, but that compilation and build step goes from csc.exe space notepad.txt or whatever, and then notepad.exe or whatever. It now becomes .NET, the file name extension, right? And it builds and then runs. It's fantastic.
Another change, which actually isn't about .NET 10, actually, is the support duration of STS releases. So this was actually an announcement before .NET Conf. Sometime in October, I think they made the announcement. But traditionally, or for the last 3 or 4 years, I think it's been, there have been 2 levels of support or durations of support. You've got long-term support and standard term support. Long-term support was 3 years and standard term support was 18 months. And the problem with that is that if we imagine that someone is using .NET 10 today, they downloaded it and it's got 3 years of support, but then in a year's time, .NET 11 comes out, and that's a standard term support because the Microsoft alternates. So in even-numbered years, you've got a STS release. Odd-numbered years, like 2025, was a long-term support. Yeah, .NET 10 long-term support. .NET 11 would therefore be a standard term support. And so if you were to upgrade to .NET 11 as soon as it comes out, you used to only have 18 months of support, which means that it reaches its end of life before .NET 10. .NET 10 would actually live a little 6 months longer, which means that a lot of organizations therefore said, well, there's no point in upgrading to an STS release. We might as well stick with the long-term one. And they're losing some of the main benefits. When I'm asked, what's new in .NET 10 that's worth upgrading for? Why would I upgrade to the latest version? One of the most important benefits that you get is actually not new features. It's fun to talk about the new features, whether it's a language feature or a .NET API, but for organizations, one of the most important improvements is performance and resource usage, memory usage, and so on. Particularly if you've got lots of servers that you're paying for either in the cloud or physically, if every year the performance and the memory footprint shrinks, or the memory footprint shrinks and the performance improves, then it's worth upgrading. And so I would very much push internally, if I was working for these organizations, for an annual upgrade, regardless of the support level. But anyway, going back to the change that was announced recently, standard term support has now been extended to 24 months, i.e. 2 years, which means that when .NET 11 comes out in a year's time, in November 2026, there's no longer that excuse to not upgrade. You might as well upgrade to .NET 11 because it will end its life 2 years later, which is the same time that .NET 10 would end its life as well. And so Microsoft's hoping, and I'm hoping, that therefore there will be more interest in these odd-numbered versions of .NET, .NET 11, .NET 13, .NET 15, etc. And that more organizations will therefore make that leap and gain the benefits. Even if you don't care about any new features in .NET 11, it will get better performance. And so you can reduce your costs, your running costs, as it were, for any .NET targeted platform. And by getting into the habit of doing an annual cycle, you can have far fewer breaking changes as well. Something that I suspect that a lot of these organizations who have insisted on only targeting long-term support releases is that I suspect they push out their production version running on that LTS and then never update the runtime, which actually technically means that they are not supported.
Mm-hmm.
You're only supported if you're updating a runtime every month when the bug fix versions of the runtime come out. And I suspect that the reason they like these long-term is because they don't want to do that work. So if they were doing that work and properly being supported, then it should be relatively easy to then do an upgrade because they're effectively upgrading every month anyway. But, it's sometimes it's hard to get the upper management to understand the subtleties of the support. Have you had any experience with customers or clients, or what's your opinion of LTS versus STS, Jamie?
It's a very, very interesting point of view. So most of the conversations that I've had with customers and clients is that they've expected the first S in STS to mean short-term support. So when I said to them, right, you're on standard term support if you upgrade to this, they say, no, it's short-term, isn't it? No, it's standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Long-term is long because it's 3 years. STS is standard term support. So I think part of the problem is that because LTS means long-term support, therefore the opposite must mean short-term support. I think maybe there's a semantic issue there. And I also know that, if you're hosting an app internally, you have some kind of on-premises server. Yeah, there will likely be almost no work planned for, right, there's a new version of the runtime, let's go install and run that, right?
Yep.
So just as you said, they're not supported. So they're on the long-term support, but they're not actually supported anymore because the runtime isn't being updated or upgraded to become the supported runtime. And I think there is a misunderstanding. I don't want to say miscommunication because I'm not sure it's a Microsoft thing and I'm not sure it's a people doing the work thing either, but there is some kind of breakdown in communication of this is what you need to do to maintain support. And I think that comes from people like you and me, Mark, who remember doing .NET Framework things, right? The way that .NET Framework used to work was it was tied to Windows. So when there was an update for .NET Framework, they couldn't release the update until it was ready to be rolled into Windows Update. So then the runtime would update automatically for you when Windows updates were installed. That's no longer the case because they can't, right? Because they can't. Like if I was Microsoft and I released a .NET runtime update for Windows 10 and baked it into Windows Update, first off, it's not a core part of Windows. Secondly, what about the people on Mac OS? And thirdly, what about the people on who are running their apps on Linux-based servers, right? All you're doing is you're forcing the update on one subset of people. And then suddenly you go to build and run and it doesn't work on your Linux server because it's expecting a slightly older version of the runtime. Like, you're going to break things. There is no win in this other than telling people we need to just jump on the server, run the installer, and it will just keep running. It's fine. The app may need to stop for a second whilst the installer is running. And then once the installer is completed, we can start the app again. Don't even need to reboot, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of problems with this myself recently where, yeah, exactly. There's a misunderstanding that I don't need to update the runtime because the runtime will always be updated. But then part of me thinks as well, the same problem exists in the Node ecosystem. And they have a similar support structure as well, that similar sort of standard term release and long term release. Like I have worked with clients in the past year, who are running apps on versions of Node that are so far out of date that to say that they had been end of life, I'd have to start a conversation that goes all the way back 5-6 years, right? and part of that, I think, is maybe I don't want to touch it because I don't want to break it. Maybe I don't understand that I need to keep the SDK and the runtime updated. And maybe I also don't have like you said, the time budget allotted to update and upgrade things, which is, suboptimal. And then I also know that because I've had a conversation with some of the folks on the security team over at .NET. I'm not going to name any names because some of what they have said is, we're talking over a tasty beverage. But part of the big problem with not being able to extend that support lifecycle very far is that at some point you have to stop working on the security upgrades for the runtime and start looking at what does the runtime look like in the next version and how do we support that. And there is a time similar to URI, if wherever we are working, whatever customers we're working for, there is a time budget, right? There's only so much time in a week, in a month that I can spend working on certain things. This is not me sort of saying that nobody cares about security and things like that, but like it is a moving target. And so there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much budget. And so I fully understand that at some point they need to stop supporting a version and move on to the next one. But my worry is that, again, there's a miscommunication happening with that too. I feel as though the majority of .NET devs that I have interacted with, shall we say, in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, they have this feeling of, not all of them, but a majority, I install the SDK, I install my IDE, and then when I publish, that's someone else's problem. And it's like, well, it kind of isn't. It's really not. I know that DevOps exists, and people think that DevOps is a job title. In my opinion, it's not. But just because you hand something off to someone, it doesn't mean it's no longer your responsibility, right? Those of us with children, this is a proper over-the-top metaphor, but those of us with children, when you take your child to school, that child doesn't just magically stop being your responsibility. It's a shared responsibility between you and the school. And then when the child comes home, there is an element of responsibility from the school to make sure that home life is okay. And so it's like a shared, that whole idea of it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to build and maintain a system. It isn't just one person's job. Oh, I've gotten on my soapbox now, Mark. I'm sorry. But yeah, I wonder if maybe that's it. And because of the magic of the cloud, if you're hosting on the cloud, you likely don't realize that the runtime is being updated for you automatically. So you're always supported.
Yeah, that's a really, you're right. Particularly with cloud development, or like if you're targeting Azure App Service, you're right. They're constantly updating the runtime for you, so you don't even think about it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if you're doing self-hosting, then you're going to have to, even in the cloud, you're going to have to make sure you do your monthly updates.
And I mean, there are lots of reasons to self-host, right? You don't have to just host in the cloud because everybody else is doing it. There may be regulatory reasons, or there may just be a case of, I don't want the added complexity of exposing this to the world. Maybe you want an internal app and you don't have to worry about VNets and all that kind of stuff. You just I want to put this on a server somewhere internally behind a firewall. Don't worry about it. It's fine. And that's totally legitimate too. Just wanted to say that it is obviously legitimate and perfectly fine to host things internally. If you don't have to worry about putting it on the cloud if you don't have to. But the benefit there is that they handle the runtime updates for you.
Yep. Yeah, one of the other challenges that I had with deciding how to update my apps and services book to its 3rd edition was how to handle any kind of cloud features. So in the 1st and 2nd editions of that book for .NET 7 and .NET 8, I had included quite a bit of Azure technologies. So Azure SQL Database for the database server in the cloud, Cosmos DB, the kind of document DB type, or NoSQL type database data store, Azure Functions, and so on. So there were quite a few topics about Azure in those earlier editions. But the feedback that I got from readers is that either they were concerned about cost, even just during trying things out in the book. They were kind of saying that, well, I was just going to skip that chapter because I just don't want to. They haven't tried it themselves and they're just worried about cost. But also just they might have picked some other cloud provider, AWS or Google or someone else, or even just using cloud VMs and therefore managing the actual services within them themselves. So it did appear to be that only about 5 to 10% of my readers were actually interested in Azure anyway. So I made the difficult decision to take any Azure content out of at least the paperback, out of the print book, and put that old content online. So it's still available through the GitHub repositories for those readers who still want to go through that. But certainly Azure has been de-emphasized. So I'm hoping that all readers will now be able to benefit from therefore having more space to cover kind of built-in .NET stuff in the apps and services book, while still not completely losing Azure content. Do you have any opinions on how much Azure content should be covered in a .NET book?
So here's the interesting thing, right? We mentioned it earlier on. With Aspire, you don't need to really worry about how you're hosting your app. Because my understanding is that they've worked with the AWS team, they've worked with GCP, they've worked with the major cloud providers to have, I'm going to use the wrong words, but like Aspire drivers, that's not the right word, but like an Aspire provider, right?
Yep.
So when people ask me, what's the point of Aspire? I say to them, I use Maddie's analogy. And she said to me, you know the green base plate you use for Lego? That's Aspire. You build your app and you build everything on top of it out of all of the different bits of Lego, and you can totally legitimately pull those bits of built parts off of there and go put them on the shelf yourself. Or, since it's on the green base plate, you can take that green base plate and go over to Azure. You can go over to AWS. You can go over to GCP and take the green base plate with you, Aspire with you, and Aspire will figure out how to host it. You can take it internally and say, hey, Aspire, here's my server. Go build it and make it deployed over there, right? Go do the thing. And the goal is, my understanding of the goal is that it will do that for you. You can say, that's why the verb for the Aspire command line is do. Aspire, do, publish, right? It doesn't exist, but you could do Aspire, do the thing, right? And it'll package up your application, figure out how to host it, so you don't have to write the YAML, so you don't have to write the Docker container, so that you don't have to write the Kubernetes stuff. You can just say, Aspire, I want it to look like this, to behave like this, wait for this service to be ready, make sure this external service is ready. Here is the secrets vault with all of my API keys, substitute things when it starts. Also, go run my thing. I don't know. Maybe the next version of the book doesn't need to mention cloud stuff. Maybe you can say, hey, look, you want to learn cloud stuff? Go read my book that's got the bits about Aspire in it. And then maybe just do that. I don't know.
Or, I mean, there are plenty of Azure-specific books, which, everything is about Azure in those books. So it's just that just because I haven't written a book about it doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of options. And even from other publishers, shock horror. It's...
It's an infinite game, Mark, an infinite game.
Yeah.
Everybody wins. You know that moment when a technical concept finally clicks? That's what we're all about here at the Modern.net Show. We can stay independent thanks to listeners like you. If you've learned something valuable from the show, please consider joining our Patreon or buy me a coffee. You'll find links in the show notes. We're a listener-supported and, at times, ad-supported production, so every bit of support that you can give makes a difference. Thank you. Because you've talked about a few of your favorite things, I just wondered if you'd be interested to hear a few of my favorite things, the new .NETs.
I would love to hear about your favorite things, especially if you do it to a jaunty tune. These are some of my favorite things.
I think we might get a copyright strike if I do that, but I will try. Keep an eye open for a bonus episode, folks. I'm only missing. So I think most of mine revolve around the ASP.NET core. Other than the things that you've already mentioned, model validation happening automatically is all wired up for you automatically is wonderful. I will link to, there's a blog post by Safia Abdallah, who works on many of things.NET. And Safia talks about how they're using source generators.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to gloss over the topic here, but essentially, if you have a minimal API endpoint, so that's it, it's validation on minimal APIs, right? So you have a minimal API endpoint, and you have some kind of object that you're going to be receiving as part of that request. If in your class definition, you throw the validate attributes onto your properties, what will happen is at build time, they will create source-generated files which apply the validation logic to those properties and then perform the validation for you when the request is received. So all you have to do is model.valid or is property, is class name, instance of class name.valid, and that's it. It takes away all of that, because that was one of the biggest complaints, I guess, about minimal APIs when they first started was like, where's my validation? One of those things was, why do I have to do the validation myself? And that's totally fine, right? It's a valid thing, but also it's this new thing that happens for you. The other thing that I really like is if you've ever done integration tests using the Web Application Factory, right? So the Web Application Factory is a type that you can extend in your integration tests, and it's a Web Application Factory of type T, right? And the T there is where your program exists. So you're likely going to type Web Application Factory, angle brackets, program, angle brackets. So you're saying this is a Web Application Factory for my program. Now, if you do that with the standard minimal program.cs file where it doesn't create a public class program and put everything in it, you'll find you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the file and then create a public partial class program, right? And that's because internally, when you're building your code, the automatically generated program class is an internal. So it isn't visible to anything. So you can either throw public partial class program, open squigglies, close squigglies at the bottom of your program.cs, or you can add the internals visible to attribute, which is fine, but it's something that you need to remember to do. Well, ASP.NET Core 10 does that for you. So you don't have to do the public partial class program squiggly brackets. And the reason I really like this is because I had a conversation with Mads Christensen earlier on this year about Visual Studio. And he said one of the things that they really, really like to do is solve those tiny paper cuts, the individual problems that don't cause a massive amount of issues, but they cause enough issues that it makes you stop and pause and go, wait, what? How did I solve this before? And then you have to go spelunking into some other repo, or you have to go and ask your AI tooling of choice. So you have to do a Google search. Like the worst thing to happen is for you to have to step out of the IDE to be able to fix a problem. And this is one of those things. You don't have to step out of the IDE anymore because the build tools will create this for you. And that's what, it's just one of those things that's like, of course, why didn't they do this before? This is amazing. And so, yeah, that to me is the biggest killer feature of ASP.NET Core 10 is all of this stuff that's all handled for you. It just makes it easier. I can live in the joy of writing code, right? I don't fall into the pit of despair. That's probably the worst way to put it. I don't trip over my shoelaces, right? And stumble and drop something because I forgot to put public partial class program at the bottom of my program.cs. It can do it for me, right? That's the whole point. Automation to automate the boring stuff.
100%. It's so in the earlier editions of my books, when I'm writing the integration testing chapter for the web service, and I had to say to the reader, right now, we're going to have to manually create the program class because it's not public. And you have to go through all this, you were talking there for several minutes. So I had to type out all these instructions and I could just imagine the poor reader saying, why are we doing this? Why can't it just do it for me? Well, now it can.
Yep.
And so I was able to go back to that chapter when I was updating it and just go delete, delete, delete. Don't need any of that anymore. It's all just magically going to work for you exactly as it should have done from the very beginning. Yeah, those little paper cuts and fixing all of those. I am so glad that they actually bother, because a lot of companies would not bother and they would just have these paper cuts and leave them in for years and years and years. You only have to listen to an episode of the Accidental Tech podcast with those Apple guys complaining about the documentation and the bugs which never get fixed. I'm really glad that I have focused on Microsoft and their particularly their developer platforms. The teams at Microsoft are frankly amazing. They are wonderful. They really, really care about every detail. And when things don't quite work right, you can bet that someone within Microsoft is working on that problem. So yeah, get those annual updates. You'll get all of these improvements.
And update the runtime. Update the runtime. Just like if you haven't done it.
Yes, every month.
Hey, you've already updated it. Check if there's another update. Just go to get.net, which sounds really stupid to say out loud. But if I can Americanize it, get.net. That will take you straight through to the download page for the operating system you're running, which I think is a fantastic way to do it.
Yep, definitely.
Put it in your calendar every month. Just go there and check. Or maybe you can, here's the thing, right? Write a playwright script. Don't do this because you might end up DDoSing the website. Write a playwright script that checks the website every 2 days. And if there's an update, it will tell you, hey, there's an update. Automate the boring stuff.
Absolutely. And I haven't tried this yet myself, and bits of it are still in preview anyway at the time of recording. But I was very excited when Maddie was talking about the Aspire dashboard and its integration with MCP, Model Context Protocol, so that you can then go to your favorite LLM and just say, why is the server down? What's going on? And it can be talking directly to the dashboard on Aspire and integrating with all of your open telemetry that's being recorded and explain or kind of fix automatically any kind of problems. I mean, it's a very exciting time to be any developer, I suppose, but I think particularly a .NET developer, because the teams are just doing amazing things. It's very, very exciting time.
Absolutely. There was a public call that I was watching. It was one of the Aspire Fridays, I think it was, where they'd done something. They'd gone through most of the process of setting things up. And like most developers, they don't commit till they get to a feature that works, right? But then something stopped working. They're like, oh no, how do we do? And there's 5 people on the call. And they're all shouting over each other. Go to this and do this and do. And they're all remote, so they're all talking over each other. And you can't. It's just a cacophony of noise, right? And then it was like, well, if I push the MCP button, I can ask the MCP why this didn't start, and it can figure it out for me because it has access. Like you said, it's got access to the running application, the dashboard, the logs, the build logs, the runtime log. It's got access to all of that. So rather than you going, and I used the phrase earlier on, but rather than you going spelunking through it all, you can ask your LLM of choice, hey, before I go and check, is there anything that looks obvious to you as to why this is broken? And then it will likely say, yeah, it's here. Like literally go to this file, in fact, don't go to, I will do it for you, right? I'll go to the file, I'll edit it, and then I'll stop and start.
Agentic.
Exactly, right? And it just stops and starts the application for you if you need it. It's fantastic. Because that's what it is. The AI agent, the reason that we use the noun agent is because something that does something for you. Similar to like a travel agent, right? You want to go traveling, you might go to a travel agent and say, I want to visit here, here, and here in this week, this calendar week, and I'm willing to pay some money, go figure it out and build me an itinerary, figure out my flights, figure out maybe my currency conversion, figure out a hotel for me to stay in, maybe figure out travel between the hotels and the events. And that's literally what they do, right? And so that's why they're called agents, because they figure out those minutiae. So yeah, Mark, it has been yet another fantastic conversation. I'm hoping the folks will have listened to us geek out, nerd out, get excited about .NET 10 and actually start the process, if they haven't already, start the process of investigating how they can move on. Just real quick, before we leave this, actually, I did, time of recording, I upgraded one of my open source libraries to .NET, and it was literally a semicolon NET 10.0. So it was an 8-character change.
Perfect.
That's all I needed to do. Type in 8 characters and then hit build. And it worked. Because my library targets multiple .NETs, I just had to put a semicolon, net 10.0, hit save, and it was migrated, right? I'm the lucky one in that my code is relatively trivial, so there's not a lot going on there. But if you have NuGet packages, you may need to wait for them to upgrade. You may not. Some parts are backwards compatible. Who knows? But yes, anyway, moving past that. Mark, It has been, as it always is, an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm just wondering, in these final few minutes, would you be able to perhaps remind the listeners of the book titles? Because remember, Mark's a prolific author. He's got a lot going on. Go buy his books, folks. And maybe if you're on socials or anything like that, if folks want to reach out and say, hey, Mark, I got a question, or hey, Mark, this book is amazing. So they can give you that feedback, right?
Yes, perfect. Thank you for inviting me again, Jamie. It's been a great conversation and hopefully valuable for your listeners, as well as maybe slightly entertaining. So to summarize, I've recently written a 4-part or 4-book .NET 10 series, starting with C# 14 and .NET 10, Modern Cross-Platform Development Fundamentals, bit of a mouthful. Then we've got the real-world web development with .NET 10. Then we've got apps and services with .NET 10. And tools and skills for .NET 10. So 4 books, all updated for .NET 10, and they've been published between November and about January 2026, so the last few months. My publisher Pact has got a Discord server with individual channels for each of those books. So if you want to message me there and have a live chat, that's great. We have some interesting conversations, and I can give feedback and help with anyone who's maybe struggling a bit with my books. I also have a GitHub repository, which is probably the best place to keep up to date with my books, because you can raise an issue. Each book has its own GitHub repository. You can raise issues there. Let me know if you've spotted a typo or you're having a problem. All of the source code for all of the code that I show you in the books is also on those GitHub repositories. And the best kind of starting point is my personal GitHub repository, which is just my name, Mark J. Price, MarkJprice, Mark J. Price. So that's my GitHub repository. From there, you've got links to all of my repos and additional materials. So start there, and then hopefully I'll see you on the Discord channels.
Wonderful. I will have as many links to those things as I can in the show notes. So if you're listening along, don't worry about scribbling those things down. When you have the chance, press, click, whatever paradigm you're using. You might be listening on YouTube. You may be listening in an app. You may be listening through some other means. Find the show notes, click that, and they will be right there. There will be links to everything in both the full show notes with the full transcription and the thing that is displayed in your device right now. So go find those and click those buttons, connect with Mark, and go buy his books.
Thank you again, Jamie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you ever so much. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Modern.NET Show with me, Jamie Taylor. I'd like to thank this episode's guest for graciously sharing their time, expertise, and knowledge with us. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at the podcast's website, and there'll be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .NETCore.show/review for ways to do that. Reach out via our contact page at .NETCore.show/contact, or join our Discord server at .NETCore.show/discord, all of which are linked in the show notes. But above all, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope that I'll see you again next time for some more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.